I didn't expect my own family to laugh when my army service came up at the barbecue. But that's exactly what happened. My sister raised her wine glass and smirked at the crowd like she was delivering a punchline. "Come on," she said loudly. "Emily wasn't exactly saving the world over there. She just wanted attention." Everyone chuckled. My brother leaned back in his chair and added, "Yeah, our little soldier thinks she's a hero now." Even my mother laughed. After 12 years in the army, deployments, funerals, nights that never really left my head, to them, it was a joke. So I set my plate down, looked around that table one last time, and said something none of them took seriously. "All right," I said calmly, "you win." Then I walked away from that barbecue, from that family, and 3 months later, their perfect lives started falling apart. And the worst part? They finally realized the one person they mocked was the only one holding everything together. The smell of grilled burgers and sweet barbecue sauce drifted across my parents' backyard, mixing with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. It was the kind of summer afternoon that looked perfect in photographs. Bright sun, green grass, a long wooden table filled with food, and a big family gathered together. To anyone passing by, it probably looked like a happy reunion. To me, it felt like standing on the edge of a place where I didn't quite belong anymore. I stood near the fence with a paper plate in my hand, watching everyone talk over each other the way families do. My father stood by the grill, flipping burgers like he always had. My mother moved between tables with a bowl of potato salad, making sure everyone had enough to eat. And my sister Vanessa sat at the center of it all, exactly where she liked to be. Vanessa had always been the golden child. Even now, at 33, she carried herself like the star of every room she entered. Her long blonde hair was perfectly styled, her sunglasses perched on her head like some kind of crown. She worked in marketing for a tech company in the city, and every conversation somehow found its way back to her promotions, her travel, or the expensive restaurants she had recently discovered. People listened. They always did. Next to her sat my younger brother Brandon, already halfway through his third beer, even though it wasn't yet 3 in the afternoon. Brandon had a talent for drifting through life without taking responsibility for much of anything. He bounced between jobs the way other people switched TV channels. Yet somehow, no matter what he did wrong, the family always found a way to excuse it. That had been the pattern my whole life. Vanessa succeeded, Brandon struggled, and me? I was the quiet middle ground that nobody quite noticed. I set my plate down on the edge of the table and leaned against the fence for a moment, letting the sun warm my shoulders. After 12 years in the army, silence like this felt strange. In the service, you learned to live inside constant noise, helicopters, engines, radios crackling, boots hitting gravel. Even when the battlefield went quiet, your mind never really did. But here, in my parents' backyard, the world seemed calm, almost too calm. My father looked over from the grill and waved the spatula in my direction. "Emily," he called, "burger's ready. Come grab it before Brandon eats everything." Brandon lifted his beer in mock defense. "Hey, I'm just doing my part." A few people laughed. I walked over and took the burger my father handed me. His face was older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. Retirement had softened him a little, but he still carried that steady calm that had always made him the quiet backbone of the family. "Good to have you home," he said quietly. I nodded. "Still getting used to it," I said. That was the simplest way to explain what it felt like after leaving the army. You return home and suddenly everything moves at a different pace. The world feels softer, slower, almost unreal. People complain about traffic or long lines at the grocery store, and you're standing there thinking about desert heat or night patrols or the weight of a radio strapped to your vest while the sky stays pitch black around you. But most people don't want to hear those stories, so you learn not to tell them. My father gave my shoulder a gentle pat before turning back to the grill. "Good to have you home," he said. Those 5 words meant more than he probably realized. I took a bite of the burger and walked back toward the table where the rest of the family had gathered. Vanessa was in the middle of telling a story about a corporate retreat in Napa Valley. And the hotel had this rooftop pool that overlooked the vineyards, she said dramatically. Honestly, it was the most relaxing weekend I've had all year. Brandon leaned forward. "Must be nice," he said. Vanessa shrugged casually. "Well, if you worked somewhere that valued you, Brandon." Everyone chuckled. That was Vanessa's style, a joke wrapped around a criticism. She noticed me approaching and lifted her glass of white wine. "Well, look who finally joined the party, our very own soldier." The way she said soldier made it sound like a nickname someone might give a kid playing dress-up. I pulled out a chair and sat down. "Hey, Vanessa." She tilted her head slightly, studying me. "So," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "what exactly do you do now that you're back? Still marching around, barking orders at people?" A few people laughed politely. I took another bite of my burger before answering. "Just figuring things out." "Translation," Brandon said, leaning back in his chair, "she doesn't know what normal life looks like anymore." More laughter. None of it was especially cruel, but it carried that familiar edge, the subtle way they talked about my service like it was some strange hobby I had taken too seriously. Vanessa took a sip of wine and leaned forward with a playful smile. "You know," she said, to the whole table, "I still don't really understand what you actually did over there." I didn't respond immediately, because the truth wasn't something you explained over potato salad and paper plates. What do you say? That you had spent nights sitting in armored vehicles watching the road for shadows? That you had helped carry wounded soldiers into helicopters while the sound of the rotors drowned out everything else? That you still remember the quiet moment when a flag was folded and handed to someone's family? Those weren't stories people wanted to hear at a barbecue, so I just shrugged. "Just my job." Vanessa smirked. "Well, I mean, come on," she said, glancing around the table. "Emily wasn't exactly saving the world over there." The table went quiet for half a second. Then she laughed. "She just wanted a little adventure, right?" Brandon raised his beer. "Our brave warrior." A few people chuckled again. Someone clapped lightly. I stared down at the table, watching a drop of barbecue sauce slide slowly across my plate. 12 years. 3 deployments, and somehow the story had turned into a joke. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the attention. "You have to admit," she said to the group, "Emily always liked dramatic things. Army uniforms, medals, all that stuff." She waved her hand dismissively. "It's basically cosplay with better marketing." The table erupted in laughter. Even my mother laughed a little as she refilled someone's drink. I felt something shift quietly inside my chest. Not anger, not exactly, more like a door closing. Because in that moment, I realized something very simple. They truly didn't understand what those 12 years had meant. And worse, they didn't care to. Brandon wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "Seriously, though, imagine thinking you're some kind of hero." Vanessa lifted her glass again. "To our fearless soldier." Everyone raised their drinks, even my mother. I looked around the table slowly. My sister smiling, my brother grinning, my mother chatting, and the rest of the family watching like this was just another funny story. No one noticed my father standing quietly near the grill, his expression unreadable. I set my burger down on the plate, and then I stood up. The chair scraped softly against the wood deck. Vanessa looked up, still smiling. "Oh, relax, Emily," she said. "We're just teasing." Maybe they were, but sometimes teasing reveals the truth people usually hide. I brushed my hands together and looked around the table one last time. 12 years of service, 3 deployments, and somehow the only thing my family saw was a punchline. Vanessa leaned forward again. "Come on," she said to me. "Don't tell me you're actually offended." I met her eyes calmly. "No," I said. "I'm not offended." She relaxed immediately, satisfied, but I wasn't finished. I picked up my plate and set it carefully in the trash bin near the fence. Then I turned back toward the table. "Actually," I said quietly, "you're right." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "About what?" I looked around at all of them, the family I had grown up with, the people who had no idea what those 12 years had really been, and suddenly something inside me became very clear. I said, "You win," calmly. Vanessa laughed. "Well, of course we do." But she had no idea what I meant, because while they were still laughing, I was already deciding something that would change all of our lives, and none of them realized it yet. Not Vanessa, not Brandon, not my mother, not even my father standing quietly near the grill. But in that moment, sitting under the warm summer sun with laughter echoing across the backyard, I began to understand something very simple. Sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is walk away from a battle that was never worth fighting. And that barbecue was the last one I would ever attend. The strange thing about walking away from a life isn't the moment you leave. It's the silence that comes after. When I drove away from my parents' house that afternoon, the sun was still high in the sky. The barbecue laughter faded behind me as the road curved toward the highway, and within minutes the sound of it all was gone. No shouting, no teasing, no jokes about my service. Just the quiet hum of the engine and the wind slipping through the half-open window. For the first time in a long while, my chest felt lighter. Not happy, but lighter, because something inside me had finally accepted a truth I'd spent years avoiding. I didn't belong there anymore. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove an hour north to a small apartment I had rented 2 months earlier when I returned from my final deployment. It wasn't much, a small second-floor unit above an old bookstore. The wooden floors creaked when you walked across them, and the kitchen window overlooked a narrow street where a coffee shop opened every morning at 6. But it was quiet, and quiet, I had learned, was something you learn to value after years in the Army. I carried my bag upstairs and dropped it by the couch. For a few minutes, I just stood there in the dim living room, listening to the soft ticking of the wall clock. The world outside the Army always felt slower. In the service, every decision mattered. Every movement had purpose. Out here, people spent half their time talking about things that didn't really mean anything. What restaurant to try next, which show to binge, who posted what on social media. After years of patrols, briefings, and responsibility, the normal world sometimes felt strangely empty. But it was still mine to rebuild, and that night I started making decisions. The first thing I did was open my laptop. My inbox was already full. There were messages from a veterans transition program I had been considering, a few job listings sent by former military friends, and a handful of emails from organizations that helped former soldiers find new careers. I read through them carefully. Not once did my mind drift back to the barbecue, because something important had changed. For years, I had tried to maintain both worlds, the disciplined life of a soldier and the chaotic expectations of my family. But after that afternoon, the choice had been made for me. I wasn't going to keep fighting for a place at that table. Not anymore. 3 days passed before the first phone call came. It was my mother. I watched the phone vibrate across the kitchen counter for a few seconds before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Emily," she said. "Where did you go after the barbecue? You left so suddenly." I leaned against the counter. "Just needed some air." "Well," she said with a light laugh, "Vanessa thought you were mad about the jokes." "I'm not mad." There was a small pause. "You know how your sister is," my mother continued. "She didn't mean anything by it." That sentence had followed me my entire life. Vanessa didn't mean it. Brandon didn't mean it. Someone always had an excuse. "I know," I said calmly. "Well, good," she said. "We're having dinner next weekend. You should come." I looked out the window toward the empty street below. For years, I had automatically said yes to things like that. But something had shifted. "I can't," I said. "Oh, why not?" "I've got some things to focus on." Another pause. Well, all right, she said slowly, but don't disappear on us, okay? I didn't respond right away, because disappearing was exactly what I was planning to do. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. The way soldiers sometimes leave a place when their mission is done. The next week was busy. I attended meetings with 2 veteran support groups. I signed up for a training program focused on logistics management, something that translated surprisingly well from my military experience, and I began volunteering twice a week at a small organization that helped homeless veterans find housing. The first time I walked into that building, the smell of coffee and old paper instantly reminded me of the Army. Men and women who had served sat around folding tables, filling out paperwork, sharing stories, helping each other navigate a world that often moved on without them. They understood something most civilians never did, that leaving the military didn't mean the war inside you ended. It just meant you had to carry it differently. For the first time since coming home, my chest felt useful again, and I liked that feeling. Meanwhile, life continued for my family, at least on the surface. Vanessa kept posting pictures from expensive restaurants and rooftop parties. Brandon posted photos from bars and weekend trips with friends. My mother continued sharing cheerful updates about family gatherings. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But things rarely stay perfect for long, especially when the person quietly holding everything together disappears. It started with something small. 2 weeks after the barbecue, my father called. That alone was unusual. My father rarely called anyone. He was the kind of man who believed conversations happened face to face, not through phones. "Emily," he said when I answered. "Hey, Dad. How are you settling in?" "Doing all right." He hesitated before continuing. "You know, things have been a little hectic here lately." I didn't ask what he meant, because part of me already knew. Families often look stable until one piece quietly disappears. Then the balance shifts. "Well," I said gently, "I hope everything works out." My father sighed softly. "Me too." Before hanging up, he added something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "Your sister doesn't realize how much you did for this family." I didn't ask him to explain, because part of me already knew. For years, I had been the one solving quiet problems behind the scenes, helping my parents with paperwork, fixing things around the house, handling emergencies when Brandon got into trouble, driving my mother to doctor appointments when my father was working late. I had done those things automatically, without keeping track. Not because anyone asked me to, but because soldiers learned something early in their training. If something needs to be done, you do it. You don't wait for credit. You don't expect applause. You just take care of the mission. But when the soldier disappears, the work doesn't disappear with them. A month passed before I heard from Vanessa again. She didn't call. She sent a text. "Hey, Mom says you've been avoiding family dinners." I stared at the message for a moment before replying. "Just busy." Her response came almost instantly. "You're still mad about the barbecue, aren't you?" I typed slowly. "No." 3 dots appeared. Then another message. "Good, because honestly, Emily, you're being kind of dramatic." I looked at the screen and smiled faintly. The strange thing about distance is that it gives you clarity. For the first time in years, Vanessa's words didn't affect me because I had already stepped outside the battlefield she was fighting on. "Take care, Vanessa," I wrote, and then I put the phone down. But while I was building a new life, small cracks were beginning to appear in theirs. Brandon lost his latest job after missing too many shifts. Vanessa started complaining online about problems at work. My mother called twice asking if I could help with paperwork she didn't understand. Each time I politely explained I was busy, not out of revenge, but because my life had finally begun moving forward. And soldiers know something civilians often forget. You can't protect people who refuse to respect you. One evening, about 6 weeks after the barbecue, I finished a late volunteer shift and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my father again. His voice sounded more tired this time. "Emily," he said. "Yeah, Dad?" There was a long pause. Then he said something that told me the silence I had created was finally starting to echo back toward them. Things here aren't going as smoothly as they used to. I leaned against the brick wall outside the building. "What happened?" He hesitated. "Well," he said slowly, "it turns out you were doing a lot more for this family than anyone realized." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of satisfaction, but out of a quiet understanding, because sometimes people only see your value after you're gone. And for the first time since that summer barbecue, my family was beginning to feel exactly what my absence looked like. They just didn't know yet how much worse things were about to become. For a while, the distance between me and my family felt like a quiet lake, still, undisturbed. But lakes don't stay calm forever. Eventually, something falls into the water, and the ripples spread everywhere. The first real ripple came from Brandon. It was a Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed while I was at the Veterans Housing Center. I had just finished helping a former Marine fill out an application for temporary housing when I saw my father's name on the screen again. He almost never called during the day. I stepped outside into the hallway and answered. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded strained. "Emily, are you busy?" "A little. What's going on?" There was a pause long enough that I could hear him exhale slowly. "It's Brandon." That alone told me the situation was serious. "What happened?" I asked. "He was arrested last night." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not because I was shocked, but because a part of me had always known this day would come. Brandon had been skating on thin ice for years. Missed jobs, unpaid bills, bad friends, reckless decisions. Every time he got close to real consequences, someone in the family stepped in. Often, that someone had been me. "What was he arrested for?" I asked calmly. "Driving under the influence," my father said, "and resisting arrest." I leaned against the wall. And apparently he argued with the officer. Of course he did. Brandon had never been good at accepting authority. The irony of that thought wasn't lost on me. For 12 years I had served under some of the strictest discipline imaginable. Meanwhile, my brother couldn't even follow the most basic laws. "Where is he now?" I asked. "He posted bail this morning. Your mother is very upset." I didn't respond. Because for years, I had been the one making phone calls, finding lawyers, smoothing over situations before they became disasters. But this time, I had stepped away from that role. My father seemed to sense that hesitation. "Emily," he said gently, "I know you've been busy, but Brandon could really use your help." There it was, the familiar request, the quiet expectation that I would once again step in and fix things. I took a slow breath. "Dad," I said softly, "Brandon is 31 years old. I know that. He needs to start handling his own mistakes." There was a long silence on the line. Finally, my father sighed. "I'm probably right." He sounded older than usual, tired. "I just thought maybe you'd know what to do." For a moment, I almost said yes. Old habits are hard to break. But soldiers also learn something else during their service. You can't carry someone forever. Eventually, they have to stand on their own. "I hope everything works out," I said. And then we hung up. 3 days later, the second fracture appeared. This time it came from Vanessa. I was sitting in a small cafe near my apartment, reviewing training materials for the logistics program I had started, when my phone buzzed with a flood of notifications. At first, I ignored them, but they kept coming. Text messages, emails, social media alerts. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I opened one of the messages from a friend I had served with in the army. "Hey, isn't this your sister?" There was a link attached. I tapped it. The video loaded slowly. At first, it looked like one of Vanessa's usual marketing presentations. Bright lights, a stage, a microphone clipped to her jacket. She was speaking confidently to a small crowd at what looked like a company event. But the video had been clipped to a specific moment. Vanessa laughed and said something that made the audience chuckle. I mean, honestly, sometimes companies act like hiring veterans is some kind of noble charity project. The crowd laughed. She continued, "Don't get me wrong, I respect the military, but let's be honest, not everyone coming out of the army has skills that translate to real business." More laughter. Then she added the line that had turned the clip viral. "My own sister spent 12 years marching around with a rifle. That doesn't exactly prepare you for corporate strategy." The video ended. I stared at the screen for several seconds. The internet had already done what it always does. The clip had spread fast. Thousands of comments were already appearing under the video. Some people were defending her, but most were furious. Veterans from across the country had begun responding. One comment read, "As a former Marine, I can assure you the leadership and logistic skills we learn could run circles around half the corporate world." Another said, "This woman's sister spent 12 years and this is how she talks about her?" I leaned back in my chair slowly. Vanessa had always loved attention, but attention doesn't always arrive in the form people expect. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my mother. "Emily, have you seen what Vanessa said online?" I typed back, "Yes." 3 dots appeared immediately. She didn't mean it like that. I almost laughed. The same sentence again. Vanessa didn't mean it. But the internet doesn't care what you meant. It only cares what you said. By that evening, the situation had exploded. The video had been shared thousands of times. Veterans organizations began posting responses. A few news outlets picked it up. Vanessa tried to explain herself in a follow-up post, but the damage had already been done. And the company she worked for? They didn't enjoy negative publicity, especially not publicity that involved insulting military veterans. 2 days later, my father called again. I answered while walking home from the training center. "Emily," he said heavily. "What happened?" "Vanessa was suspended from work today." I wasn't surprised. "Temporary?" I asked. "They said they're reviewing the situation." I could picture my sister pacing around her apartment, furious at the world. For the first time in her life, consequences had arrived without warning. My father cleared his throat. "She's pretty upset." I didn't doubt that. "What do you want me to do?" I asked gently. Another pause. Then he said something honest. "I don't know." That night, I sat on the small balcony outside my apartment and watched the city lights flicker on across the street. The air was cool, quiet. For years, I believed my family needed me to survive. But now, I was seeing something different. They hadn't needed me. They had simply become used to me fixing things. And when the person who fixes problems disappears, problems start showing themselves. My phone buzzed one last time before midnight. It was a message from Vanessa, the first one she had sent since the barbecue. "Are you enjoying this?" I stared at the text. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but eventually I typed a simple reply. "No." A minute later, another message arrived. "Because it feels like you disappeared right when everything started going wrong." I looked up at the quiet sky above the city. The truth was simple. Everything had been going wrong for years. My family just hadn't noticed, not while I was there quietly holding the pieces together. I set the phone down on the table and leaned back in my chair, because one thing was becoming very clear. The cracks in my family's perfect life were no longer small, they were spreading, and soon, those cracks were going to break something none of them were prepared for. The first snowfall of the season arrived quietly. It dusted the rooftops of the small town where I now lived and settled along the sidewalks like a thin white blanket. Winter had a way of slowing everything down, and in that stillness, life sometimes revealed truths people had been too busy to notice before. I had grown used to the quiet of my apartment above the bookstore. Mornings began with coffee from the cafe downstairs. Afternoons were spent at the training center or volunteering with the Veterans Housing Program. Evenings were simple: reading, studying logistics casework, sometimes walking through the snowy streets with nothing but the sound of my boots against the pavement. For the first time in years, my life had rhythm again. Not the rigid discipline of military life, but something calmer, something that belonged to me. Still, family has a way of echoing through your mind, even when you've stepped away from it. By the time December arrived, I hadn't seen any of them in nearly 4 months, not since the barbecue. The distance had grown quietly at first, like frost spreading across a window. My mother had called less frequently. Vanessa had stopped messaging after her brief confrontation. Brandon hadn't reached out at all. Only my father continued calling from time to time, and even those conversations had become shorter. Not angry, just careful, as if both of us understood we were standing on opposite sides of something neither of us quite knew how to cross. One evening, about a week before Christmas, I received another call from him. I was sitting at my kitchen table with paperwork spread across the surface, housing applications, veteran support documents, training notes. My phone buzzed quietly beside the lamp. "Dad." I answered. "Hey." His voice sounded older than usual. "Emily?" A pause followed. Then he said something unexpected. "Are you warm enough where you are?" I glanced toward the window where snow was collecting along the frame. "I'm fine." "That apartment still above the bookstore?" "Yeah." Another pause. He cleared his throat. "Your mother put up the Christmas tree today." I could picture it instantly. The old artificial tree they'd had for almost 20 years, the box of ornaments stored in the basement, my mother carefully hanging each one while holiday music played softly in the background. For most families, those moments create warmth. For mine, they used to. "Vanessa didn't come over," he added. "That's unusual." "She's been keeping to herself." I didn't ask about her job. I already knew things hadn't gone well. The fallout from her viral comments had spread farther than anyone expected. Her company eventually let her go quietly, citing reputational concerns. Vanessa had spent most of the past 2 months fighting critics online. But the internet rarely forgets. Eventually, she stopped posting altogether. My father sighed softly on the phone. "Dinner felt strange tonight." "Why?" There was another pause before he answered. "Your chair was empty." Something in his voice shifted when he said it. Not dramatic, just honest. I leaned back in my seat. "I'm sure you managed." "That's the thing," he said quietly. "We didn't." That conversation stayed with me long after the call ended. Not because of guilt, but because of what it revealed. Sometimes absence speaks louder than presence. And when you remove a single piece from a system that has relied on it for years, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. 2 days later, my mother called. Her tone was different from usual, more fragile. "Emily," she said gently, "would you consider coming for Christmas dinner?" I watched the snow drifting outside my window. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. Part of me missed them, but another part remembered that laughter around the barbecue table. "I just think everyone needs some space," I said carefully. My mother sighed. "I know things were said that day." "That's not really the point." "What is the point?" I thought about it. Then I answered honestly. "For years, I tried to make everything work." She didn't interrupt. "So now I'm trying something different."
Silence filled the line. Finally, she spoke softly. "Your father misses you." I swallowed. "I miss him too. But that doesn't change what happened." My mother's voice wavered slightly. "Christmas won't feel the same without you." I looked around my small apartment. It wasn't decorated. No lights, no tree, just quiet. But somehow it didn't feel lonely. "Sometimes things have to change," I said. Then we said goodbye. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The town was covered in snow and soft yellow lights glowed from the windows of nearby houses. Families were gathering everywhere, children laughing, music drifting through the air. Inside my apartment, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window. I didn't feel sad, not exactly, more reflective. 12 years in the army taught me that life moves in phases. You serve, you fight, you survive, and eventually you learn how to live again. My phone buzzed just after 8 that evening. Another message from my father, but instead of text, he sent a photo. I opened it. It was their dining table, the same long wooden table from the barbecue, plates set, candles lit, my mother standing near the kitchen doorway, Vanessa sitting quietly on one side, Brandon staring down at his phone, and at the far end of the table, an empty chair. My chair. A message followed the photo. "Dinner didn't start yet." Then another. "Your mother keeps looking at that chair." I stared at the image for a long time, not because I was tempted to drive there, but because the picture said something words never could. For the first time, they could see the space I had left behind. Later that night, my father called again. His voice was softer than usual. "We finished dinner." "How was it?" "Quiet." He hesitated. "Vanessa tried to make a joke at one point." "And?" No one laughed. I could almost imagine the scene, the golden child realizing her audience had changed. Brandon left early. He said he had somewhere to be, but I think he just didn't want to sit at that table anymore. Another long pause followed. Then my father said something that surprised me. I should have said something that day. "At the barbecue?" I closed my eyes. "You didn't." "I know." His voice carried regret now, and I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Snow tapped lightly against my window as he continued. "You spent 12 years serving your country." "Yes." "And somehow we turned that into a joke." I didn't respond, because he wasn't asking for an argument. He was acknowledging the truth. He said, "I should have stopped it. You were my daughter." The words hung in the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added quietly, "You were also the strongest person at that table." Over the next few weeks, the calls between us became more frequent. Not about family drama, just conversations. About life, about my volunteer work, about his retirement projects around the house. And slowly, piece by piece, the deeper truth of my absence began to surface. One evening, near the end of winter, my father called again. "Emily," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "You and my mother were thinking about visiting." I was surprised. "Visiting?" "Yes." "To see your new place." I looked around the apartment. It was simple, but it was mine. "I think that would be all right," I said. He sounded relieved. "Good." Then he added quietly, "And maybe, if you're comfortable, Vanessa would like to talk to you too." I didn't answer right away, because forgiveness is complicated. But I also knew something important. Walking away had never been about revenge. It had been about dignity, about creating space where respect could exist again. "Maybe," I said finally. And for the first time since the barbecue, the distance between us felt a slightly smaller. Not repaired, not forgotten, but understood. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson a family can learn is the one taught by an empty chair. The snow was almost gone by the time my father called to confirm the visit. Patches of winter still clung to the shaded parts of the streets, but the sun had begun staying out longer each afternoon. The town was slowly waking up again after months of cold. Spring has a way of doing that. It reminds people that things can start over. I was standing inside the Veterans Housing Center when the call came.
The small office smelled like fresh coffee and printer ink, and the sound of quiet conversation drifted from the hallway where two former soldiers were filling out paperwork. "Emily," my father said when I answered. "Hey, Dad. We were thinking of driving up Saturday morning." "Okay." "Your mother is very excited." I smiled slightly. "That sounds like Mom." He hesitated. "Vanessa asked if she could come too." There it was again. The question neither of us had pushed too hard. "Is she expecting a conversation?" I asked. "I think she's expecting a chance." I leaned back in my chair. For months, I had built a new life that didn't revolve around family conflict. The quiet of that life had become something I valued. But avoiding something forever doesn't always solve it. Sometimes you face it once, so you can move on for good. "She can come," I said. My father exhaled softly. "Thank you." "And Brandon?" "He won't be joining us." I wasn't surprised. Brandon had always avoided uncomfortable situations. Still, a small part of me wondered if he would eventually appear anyway. Families have a way of pulling people back together, even when they resist. Saturday morning arrived bright and cool. The town looked different now that winter had loosened its grip. Small puddles reflected the sky along the sidewalks, and the cafe downstairs had placed tables outside again. I spent the morning cleaning my apartment. Not obsessively, just enough that it felt welcoming. The place was simple: a small living room, a narrow kitchen, 2 windows overlooking the street. A bookshelf filled one wall, mostly with training manuals and a few novels I'd started reading again now that life had slowed down. The doorbell rang just after 11. I took a breath before opening it. My mother stood there first, her eyes filled with emotion the moment she saw me. "Oh, Emily!" She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me before I had time to react. For a second, I stood still. Then I hugged her back. Behind her, my father gave me a small nod, and standing slightly behind them, Vanessa. She looked different, not dramatically, but something in her posture had changed. The easy confidence she once carried into every room had softened. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi." I stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment suddenly felt smaller with 3 extra people inside. My mother immediately began looking around with curiosity. "Oh, this is lovely," she said. "So cozy." My father walked to the window and glanced down at the street. "You've got a nice view." Vanessa stayed near the door for a moment before finally stepping farther inside. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. The books, the small table, the stack of folders from the housing center sitting neatly in one corner. "This is where you've been living?" "Yeah." She nodded slightly. "It suits you." That comment surprised me. Vanessa had never been someone who appreciated simplicity, but then again, people change when life humbles them. We sat around the small kitchen table with coffee. For a while, the conversation stayed safe. My mother asked about my job at the Veterans Housing Program. My father asked about the logistics training I had completed. Vanessa mostly listened. Eventually, my father leaned back in his chair. "I'm proud of what you've built here," he said. "Thanks." He glanced at Vanessa briefly before speaking again. "You know, I told them the other day that Emily could probably run an entire logistics company if she wanted." My sister gave a faint smile. "That doesn't surprise me anymore." There was an awkward silence after that, the kind that waits for something deeper to happen. Finally, Vanessa cleared her throat. "Emily, can we talk?" My mother shifted uncomfortably, but my father simply nodded once and stood up. "Your mother and I are going to walk downstairs to that cafe." He looked at me briefly. "We'll give you two some space." A minute later, the apartment door closed behind them, and suddenly it was just the two of us. Vanessa stared at her coffee cup for several seconds. "I've been rehearsing this conversation in my head for weeks," she said. "That sounds stressful." "It is." She looked up finally. "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond immediately because apologies are easy to say. Understanding them takes longer. "That day at the barbecue," she continued, I thought I was just being funny. I know, but the truth is, I didn't respect what you did. Her voice had lost its usual sharpness. I didn't understand it, she admitted, and instead of admitting that, I turned it into a joke. I folded my hands together. That happens a lot. With civilians, with people who've never had to face certain things. Vanessa nodded slowly. I realized that after the video went viral. She let out a small breath. I had thousands of veterans telling me exactly how wrong I was. That must have been educational. She gave a humorless laugh. That's one word for it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that caught me off guard. The worst part wasn't losing my job. What was it? It was when Dad told me all the things you'd been doing for the family for years. She looked around the apartment again. I thought you were just drifting after the army. I wasn't. You're right, you weren't. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. I spent my whole life believing I was the responsible one in the family. You were responsible for your career, but you were responsible for everything else. I didn't correct her because she wasn't wrong. She swallowed before continuing. When Brandon got arrested, I realized something else. What? You weren't there to clean it up. No. And suddenly, we had to deal with the consequences ourselves. That's how adulthood usually works. Vanessa nodded. I see that now. She hesitated again before asking quietly, Do you hate me? The question hung in the air. I thought about it carefully before answering. No. She looked relieved. But I did stop trusting you. Her expression fell slightly. That's fair. Trust takes time to rebuild, but honesty is where it starts. Vanessa nodded slowly. I'm not expecting things to magically go back to normal. They won't. I know. She sat back in her chair. I just wanted you to hear the truth from me. And what truth is that? That I was wrong. Her voice didn't shake when she said it, and for the first time in my life, Vanessa sounded completely sincere. An hour later, our parents returned with sandwiches from the cafe. The mood in the apartment felt lighter. Not perfect, but honest. We sat together eating lunch while talking about ordinary things again. My father eventually leaned back in his chair and studied the room thoughtfully. You know, he said, I've been meaning to tell you something. What's that? He looked at Vanessa and my mother before continuing. After the barbecue, I started thinking about something, years ago. I raised an eyebrow. What? He clasped his hands together. Your first deployment. I remember it clearly. The long goodbye at the airport, my mother crying, my father shaking my hand instead of hugging me. I received a letter from your commanding officer back then, he said. That surprised me. You never mentioned that. I didn't think it was my place. My mother looked curious. What did it say? My father turned to me. He wrote that Emily was one of the most reliable soldiers in her unit. I felt a little embarrassed. That's just standard feedback. He shook his head. No, he wrote something else too. What? That when things got difficult, other soldiers looked to you. The room grew quiet. Leadership, my father said softly. Not because of rank, because of character. Vanessa stared at me. You never told us that. I didn't think it mattered. But it does, my father said firmly. For years, we treated your service like a story we didn't need to understand. He paused. That was our mistake. The afternoon passed slowly after that. Eventually, the sun began dropping lower in the sky. My parents stood to leave. My mother hugged me tightly again. You should come visit more often, she said. Maybe. My father shook my hand the way he always had. I'm proud of you, Emily. Thanks, Dad. Vanessa lingered near the door. I know things will take time, she said. They will, but I'm willing to work on it. I nodded. That's a good start. She smiled faintly, then they were gone. That evening, I stood by the window watching their car drive away down the street. The apartment was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. Not lonely, just peaceful.
Because sometimes closure doesn't arrive in dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrives in simple conversations where people finally say the things they should have said years ago. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the same place where my new life had begun, and I realized something important. Walking away from that barbecue hadn't destroyed my family. It had forced them to see the truth. Respect isn't giving automatically. It's earned. And sometimes the only way people learn.
Winter had slowly loosened its grip, melting into a soft, early spring. The snow that had dusted the town in December was now nothing but puddles reflecting the awakening sunlight. Birds returned to the trees, carrying songs that made even the smallest sounds in the neighborhood feel alive again. For most people, spring was renewal. For Emily, it was reflection. Her life, quiet and orderly, had settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she could have. She woke each morning, brewed her coffee just the way she liked it, and watched the city stir beneath her window. Sometimes she thought of the barbecue, the viral videos, the empty chair at Christmas, and the tension-filled birthday dinner for her father. And sometimes she caught herself smiling at the memory of how steady she had remained through it all. The irony wasn't lost on her. The family who had mocked her, disrespected her service, and tried to write her out of the story had become their own cautionary tale, and she had remained whole. Life had shifted subtly but profoundly. Sam's influence in her life continued, though he had returned to his own family routine. Their conversations, once full of dark humor and shared frustrations, had turned into reflections on growth, resilience, and small victories. Emily had learned more than ever the value of being present for herself, not just for others. One afternoon, Emily walked through the park near her apartment. Children played in the playground, parents chatted on benches, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. She watched a father teaching his son to ride a bike, remembering her own father teaching her to fish on the quiet banks of the lake years ago. That memory was a cornerstone of her life, a reminder that love wasn't always loud, that sometimes the quiet gestures mattered most. Her phone buzzed. A notification from a news site caught her attention. Local family drama makes national headlines. Emily smiled faintly and ignored it. She didn't need to relive their mistakes. But the story wasn't about her anymore. It was about her family unraveling, the consequences of neglect, and the lessons everyone else could learn. She had been a witness to it, yes, but she was no longer a participant. Emily's father had called her earlier in the week. His voice, though older, frail, and occasionally shaky, carried warmth she hadn't heard in years. "Emily, I just wanted to hear your voice," he said. There was a pause, and she could hear the faint clatter of dishes in the background. "Your mother's been better. We've all been learning." She didn't need to say much. "I'm glad, Dad," she replied. That was enough. Over time, Emily realized her family's collapse had done more than punish them. It had illuminated the quiet truths that had been buried for decades. Her mother, once a constant enabler, had begun therapy, slowly peeling back the layers of guilt and denial that had defined her life. She had started volunteering at a local community center, a small but meaningful attempt to regain purpose outside the chaos she had allowed to dominate the household. Emily knew it wouldn't erase years of damage, but it was progress. Her sister, Vanessa, continued her online apology tour for a while, then faded into obscurity. The once powerful career woman now worked a modest job at a small firm, far from the glare of her previous corporate stage. The videos that once dominated social feeds now acted as a permanent shadow over her reputation. It was humbling, Emily thought, to see how quickly life could strip away the illusions one clings to. Brandon, ever the impulsive brother, had learned painfully and slowly that no one would carry his weight forever. Odd jobs came and went, friendships had thinned to nothing, and the weight of his own choices finally caught up with him.
He had begun a slow path toward accountability, though Emily didn't attend each step. Some lessons were learned only in solitude. Emily's life, in contrast, had grown in ways she had never imagined. The quiet, the space, the freedom, these weren't voids, they were canvas for growth. She had started a small veterans mentorship program, helping young women and men transition from military to civilian life. The work was meaningful, often exhausting, but it grounded her in ways her family never could. It wasn't just about giving back. Each interaction reminded her of the strength that had carried her through years of subtle disrespect, subtle sabotage, and outright dismissal. She was teaching the next generation that dignity was earned, maintained, and fiercely protected. And more importantly, she taught them that walking away from toxicity was not weakness, but power. One afternoon, Emily walked through the park near her apartment. Children played in the playground, parents chatted on benches, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. She watched a father teaching his son to ride a bike, remembering her own father teaching her to fish on the quiet banks of the lake years ago. That memory was a cornerstone of her life, a reminder that love wasn't always loud, that sometimes the quiet gestures mattered most. Her phone buzzed. A notification from a news site caught her attention. Local family drama makes national headlines. Emily smiled faintly and ignored it. She didn't need to relive their mistakes. But the story wasn't about her anymore. It was about her family unraveling, the consequences of neglect, and the lessons everyone else could learn. She had been a witness to it, yes, but she was no longer a participant. Emily's father had called her earlier in the week. His voice, though older, frail, and occasionally shaky, carried warmth she hadn't heard in years. "Emily, I just wanted to hear your voice," he said. There was a pause, and she could hear the faint clatter of dishes in the background. "Your mother's been better. We've all been learning." She didn't need to say much. "I'm glad, Dad," she replied. That was enough. Over time, Emily realized her family's collapse had done more than punish them. It had illuminated the quiet truths that had been buried for decades. Her mother, once a constant enabler, had begun therapy, slowly peeling back the layers of guilt and denial that had defined her life. She had started volunteering at a local community center, a small but meaningful attempt to regain purpose outside the chaos she had allowed to dominate the household. Emily knew it wouldn't erase years of damage, but it was progress. Her sister, Vanessa, continued her online apology tour for a while, then faded into obscurity. The once powerful career woman now worked a modest job at a small firm, far from the glare of her previous corporate stage. The videos that once dominated social feeds now acted as a permanent shadow over her reputation. It was humbling, Emily thought, to see how quickly life could strip away the illusions one clings to. Brandon, ever the impulsive brother, had learned painfully and slowly that no one would carry his weight forever. Odd jobs came and went, friendships had thinned to nothing, and the weight of his own choices finally caught up with him. He had begun a slow path toward accountability, though Emily didn't attend each step. Some lessons were learned only in solitude. Emily's life, in contrast, had grown in ways she had never imagined. The quiet, the space, the freedom, these weren't voids, they were canvas for growth. She had started a small veterans mentorship program, helping young women and men transition from military to civilian life. The work was meaningful, often exhausting, but it grounded her in ways her family never could. It wasn't just about giving back. Each interaction reminded her of the strength that had carried her through years of subtle disrespect, subtle sabotage, and outright dismissal. She was teaching the next generation that dignity was earned, maintained, and fiercely protected. And more importantly, she taught them that walking away from toxicity was not weakness, but power. One day, while meeting a new mentee at the community center, a young soldier asked, "Did your family ever support you after you left the army?"
Emily thought about the barbecue, the videos, the empty chair at Christmas, and the tension-filled birthday dinner for her father, and sometimes she caught herself smiling at the memory of how steady she had remained through it all. The irony wasn't lost on her. The family who had mocked her, disrespected her service, and tried to write her out of the story had become their own cautionary tale, and she had remained whole. Life had shifted subtly but profoundly. Sam's influence in her life continued, though he had returned to his own family routine. Their conversations, once full of dark humor and shared frustrations, had turned into reflections on growth, resilience, and small victories. Emily had learned, more than ever, the value of being present for herself, not just for others. One afternoon, Emily walked through the park near her apartment. Children played in the playground, parents chatted on benches, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. She watched a father teaching his son to ride a bike, remembering her own father teaching her to fish on the quiet banks of the lake years ago. That memory was a cornerstone of her life, a reminder that love wasn't always loud, that sometimes the quiet gestures mattered most. Her phone buzzed. A notification from a news site caught her attention. Local family drama makes national headlines.